December 17th, 2022. Well, in the past few videos, I've been addressing situations about the Russia-Ukraine war, and, I've presented some ideas on what might be happening next. An interesting situation developed in the Ukrainian commander-in-chief of their armed forces, Valerii Zaluzhnyi, I think is how you pronounce it, has made some comments which pretty much fall right in line with what I've been suggesting. And he's speaking about a coming Russian offensive that will probably happen sometime in January or maybe February. And he seems to indicate this will be a rather major event, a rather major threat, which is interesting coming from that particular individual. Another general that was also did some major roles in the operations around Kherson echoed similar sentiments. Interesting enough that they present in the viewpoint of the possibility that the Russians are going to make another move on their capital, Kyiv. And so that's a little different than what I've been saying, but it is addressing the concentration of Russian forces in Belarus and the recent developments in which the army of Belarus has been adopting identification markers on their vehicles similar to those on the Russian vehicles, because since both Ukrainians and Russians use the same types of tanks and armored vehicles, friendly fire incidents are very easy to happen. So at any rate, I think this is an interesting development that's worthy of note, and so I want to kind of get into the situation here. By the way, please give me a like; it helps out with the algorithm. If you're subscribed, if you haven't subscribed already, please do so, and you can also just send links to this to anybody that might be interested. Yeah, so that's the kind of situation I think we're looking at here. It's interesting that the McGregor written viewpoint and now out of the mouth of the commander of the Ukrainian army is kind of saying the same thing. So at least in general terms. Also, another thing we have to realize is we are being hit with a lot of misinformation. I mean, remember that one time Putin was supposed to have fallen down steps and injured his tailbone, and then the next day he's driving a truck across the bridge to Crimea. And then the defense minister and chief of staff of the army were supposed to have been ousted, but now we've just seen a picture via Reuters of I guess they got it from a Russian source, of Putin and all these generals in a meeting at the headquarters of the Russian armed forces that are fighting in Ukraine, and it looks like their new commanders, and one of the pictures is pointing out his battle plan or whatever, and the meeting is supposed to discuss their short and medium term plans for operations. So an interesting set of developments. We keep seeing these. Remember that happened just after it was said that Putin was hiding in a bunker because he's afraid of the flu. My point is that we're being deluged with misinformation, which is interesting. Now the Western sources that we normally hear all these interesting tales from are now disagreeing with what the commander of the Ukrainian army is saying. Now, one could argue that this is a strategic deception on the part of the Ukrainians, and that in fact they're planning an offensive, because such as Sky News is continually talking about this offensive that is going to drive from Zaporizhzhia down to Mariupol and cut the Russian front in two, and then begin the assault on Crimea and so forth. So that's part of this story. And to favor that, there was a commando raid that apparently damaged a bridge between Russia and that area, so of very eastern Ukraine, or occupied Ukraine, how you want to refer to it. So this is all in the mix, so that's why I've titled this thing a jump ball in the Russia-Ukraine war, because we really don't know who's going to launch an attack first. The Russians seem to be priming for something if their troops are ready, and there's always rumors that the Ukrainians are going to launch an attack. One thing I would tend to think about this, though, is that the mobilization of 300,000 reservists, plus they've also inducted a fair number of volunteers, and the latter group, I'm not sure whether they mean they're reservists that volunteered that weren't called up, or whether there were people who had never been in the Russian army before that had just volunteered. If it's the latter, of course, they would have to go through basic training and wouldn't be usable for some time. The reservists have been going through a lot of refresher training for some time. I think the issue there isn't as much about the individuals anymore as it is the degree to which they've been effectively integrated into combat units and trained as units, and are actually have the logistics and the weapons and all the supplies necessary for operations. And of course, we're still awaiting the situation in which the ground is frozen hard enough for operations. But then again, the proposed Ukrainian attacks are also waiting for the same thing for the most part. So anyway, I just thought that's kind of an interesting set of developments. And the bombardment of Ukrainian infrastructure is continuing, with large missile barrages still coming in, although we're repeatedly told that Russia is almost out of missiles. Yet they keep launching them like they have a large supply. Very interesting. They're also nearly out of ammunition, but they continue to launch large artillery barrages. On the other hand, the Ukrainians may be running out of anti-aircraft missiles, or just not totally, but at least to some extent, because the U.S. is now proposing to bring in the Patriot air defense system to replace the S-300s that the Ukraine has been relying on. And of course, the issue there is, do we have trained Ukrainian troops that are ready to man these systems, or is this going to be some weeks or months away for the appropriate personnel to be, moved into a base in the United States for training before this can actually become an operational reality? So everybody involved in this has their difficulties. Obviously, it's a very difficult conflict. I do think that since the new Russian theater commander, Shizitsyn, I think is how it's pronounced, has been put in command of the overall effort. And interesting enough, this individual, although he has an extensive Army background, has previously been in command of the Air Force. So it may be that he's going to be better at integrating all elements of their military into a more cohesive operation than they had previously, with a lot of people who are probably more of the political generals running things. And I think, similar to Abraham Lincoln's experience at the early Civil War, he went through a lot of failed generals before he got Grant. And so we'll see how this all turns out. But that may be a factor in this, that maybe he's found somebody that can actually, he was able at least to persuade Putin to retreat from the west side of the Dnieper River. Remember, although this is being hailed as a gigantic, Ukrainian victory, it is a victory of logistics. That is, they were able to interdict the bridges across the river with the HIMARS missile systems with their precision accuracy. It wasn't so much that the Russian forces were simply beaten in battle, but I think being undersupplied and facing defeat because of lack of supplies, the new Russian commander was able to persuade the political leadership to withdraw to the safer side of the river where they can provide adequate logistics support. Meanwhile, there's a big set of offensive going on in Bakhmut, and that's the Russians seem to be gaining ground there. Latest things I've been able to see, they've actually entered parts of the city already, and the fighting continues to be heavy and high casualties. And so I guess part of what the Russian objective would be is to wear down the Ukrainian forces as they try to defend the city. And there's a lot of confusion about the details. I mean, as always in this sort of a conflict with two governments, both of which are pretty much repressive and suppressing information. So I still think that there's the forces that Russia has massed in Belarus have the characteristic that they're basically hiding behind an international boundary. If you go to the Vietnam War, the NVA did those sorts of operations, and from Cambodia and Laos, very analogous. They'd move into South Vietnam and fight, and then when the U.S. would counterattack, they'd pull back into Cambodia and Laos. And of course, one reason why this may be the integration of forces there that I discussed earlier is the possibility that the Ukraine will do the same thing that the U.S. eventually did in Vietnam, is to cross the border, and that they might end up in Belarus. So I think Russia's built up a defensive capability there to make that not a very attractive option. And the other possibility, the more modest possibility, is they'll just continue to deploy forces to block Ukrainian advances and try to achieve a favorable exchange ratio and therefore to wear them down. Or if they get aggressive and if they're capable of it, like I've said, they may attack. And apparently Colonel McGregor and me are on the same page now. I was saying it before I saw him saying it, maybe he was thinking it, is to move west of Kyiv. Not the attack Kyiv is an ambush alley, straight out. It's be a disaster for the Russians to try to drive down that wood-lined road to the capital with blown out bridges and defenders everywhere. But I think if they move west of that into the area between Poland and Kyiv, they could very well move south and cut off key supply lines and weaken the logistical support of the Ukrainian front. And then they could launch attacks south from Mariupol and north from Russia into or maybe even eastern Belarus and move south and try to encircle the forces that are defending Bakhmut and the front line. And if they were able to do that, they would achieve a substantial military victory, I think, if they can pull it off, that is. So, on the other hand, it's possible that there is a significant aid package that's going to be soon to be appropriated to provide additional weapons to Ukraine and additional economic support. So I think there is a pressure on the Russians that's kind of goes, are the troops ready for action? And on the other hand, more reinforcements are coming for Ukraine. And so it's like I say, it's a jump ball right now. Which side is going to really move first and which side will be effective? And finally, I want to make a few comments about my general attitude that I hope is not being misunderstood. My general viewpoint of this conflict is that we're suffering from additional mission creep. I mean, month by month, we're getting more and more deeper involved in it. We're stripping our own military of more and more munitions and supplies to support this operation. And so we're also running low on weapons at the same time the Russians may be. And so I think that it's time to actually consider that at this stage, we've essentially won the war in some ways. That is, if the objective is to save Ukraine from being conquered. And if you can terminate the war at this point, then you're in a position to prevent any major setbacks from the operations I've been discussing, and potentially, negotiate some sort of a solution. Remember, the Russians are under massive economic sanctions. While they haven't broken the economic economy yet, it doesn't seem like the standard of living in Russia has really suffered that much, except for certain niche Western products. In the long run, I think that that's still something that Russia needs to get out of, and it's hard to get rid of these sanctions once they're started. So I think that there would be a lot of pressure on Russia to negotiate also if they were offered a reasonable deal from their point of view. And that doesn't necessarily mean the occupation of much of Ukraine, although now that they've formally issued annexation orders, illegal though they may be, from their own point of view, that would be a major loss of face to completely pull out now, too. So that provides a major complication going forward. But at any rate, I just want to kind of do a state of what's going on. It does look like that the Russians are still pretty much intact. I think that they've stabilized their fronts pretty much, and they seem to be slowly but surely integrating all these reservists into their military. So we'll just have to wait and see what happens next. By the way, I'll also be posting this as always on Rumble, and the addresses of my social media accounts are in the description below. So I'll wrap this up for now, and until next time.